So we're going to talk about, how can you use Azure Resource Groups? How can you organize your code, your resources in those resource groups, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of a couple different approaches? And right now, the way I'm working on stuff, I actually want to do it. I want to manage them by their life cycle and their kind of purpose. So is it a persistence, set of persistence, data storage? Is it management? Is it something else? And so in that case, I've decided to go this route. And originally, when you first get into Azure, into any environment, you do as little networking as possible, and you try and figure out how stuff works. And so, in the beginning, it's a single resource group. And I'm actually kind of a big fan of this. Make a massive resource group. I don't have to manage anything. Libraries work really well. I don't have to do like cross resource group resource URIs like you do in Azure. It's just sort of magical. It assumes it's in the same resource group. So that may be the way to go for a lot of things. But I've run into a couple situations lately where I want to do it differently. And the other option is we just create a million resource groups. Every time we create a couple resources that are sort of like each other, we just, create a resource groups and we don't worry about it. And that can work too. I would like to be a little more organized about it, but it's kind of up to you. So when I say life cycle and purpose, what do I mean? I mean that we want to figure out why we're using these. So a lot of times I have a cost thing, right? So if I have a Kubernetes cluster with a lot of things deployed in it, or a bunch of VMs for stuff that are ephemeral compute, it might be super, and I don't use them that often, like especially in lower environments and dev environments and environments, certain kinds of test environments, should I just destroy everything in a resource group and then bring it back? And that can be a little difficult for data, right? Like I might want to keep my data around and then destroy all my compute and all my other stuff. And so anything that holds data, it might make sense to manage those resources in their own resource pools by lifecycle. And that kind of drives this cost optimization teardown. I can use scale up, scale down, but why bother in some cases? If it's an environment that's never used on the weekend, or it's probably not going to be used at night, if I just kill it completely and I can bring it back, the resource group tends to be the right boundary for that. And another one is going to be ownership in general, right? So a lot of times networking takes a certain amount of expertise beyond the normal dev team's expertise. And so you might provide them with an infrastructure as code template or something for their VNets and subnets. But the reality is those VNets and subnets probably need to hang around no matter what anybody's doing, because you have to be kind of disciplined about using address spaces and stuff in a lot of areas if you're an IPv4. And so ownership boundaries inside of a project might be a good way to figure out what your resource group boundaries are. And the other one is design for experimentation. I might just give everybody their own resource group and be like, this is yours, and we know who it's going to cost because you own this resource group. So there might be cases where we end up, and then, on the weekend, we might tear all those down, or off hours, we might tear down we might snapshot the ARM template, delete it, and then bring it back. And we could do that at the resource group level. So I kind of like that. And that's the end of that. So let's go look at the table I wanted to look at. So in this case, I actually ended up with a VNet with 5 subnets, and I ended up with 4 resource groups. The gateway subnet on the right, the virtual network gateway actually has to be in the same resource group as a VNet. So in this case, those two are the same. And I did this in Mermaid.js, and there's no way for me to figure out how to get this diagram to do what I want, because it's really a flowchart diagram. So on the left, we have the compute subnet and the compute resource group. And then we've got a persistent, and this is really the one that drove this entire discussion for me. I want to be able to tear everything down that's expensive and then bring back and not tear down the data, because the data, maybe had some getting it stood up, and maybe it's not all the data, but in this case, I just put my storage account in there, and that way the backup of the database or the database could be on a different life cycle than like the Bastion host. So like a Bastion host can be pretty expensive, right? And and same with a gateway, but the Bastion host can be pretty pricey. And so if I don't want to leave that Bastion host up or scale up and scale down on that, I can put it in its own resource group, and then I can kill it, and I could give that ownership of the Bastion host to a different team. And actually the VNet gateway and the Bastion host a lot of times are some core teams because they take expertise. And so I might own, as a dev team, only own the compute resource group and the persistence resource group. So I actually the thing that kicked this off was this project here. I did this VNet project. It was really to figure out how to use VNets for point-to-site VPN and Bastion hosts, and then it became this whole resource group discussion. So I hope that's useful for you. And like I said, think about, at some level, come up with a drawing of what you think you're going to want to deploy, and then look at the ownership and the life cycle and decide if it would be better to be organized around resource groups and have one or many or somewhere in between. Have a great day.